The world had changed, and it would never be the same again. In the wilderness of California in the year 2073, far from the sea, among the shadows of scattered trees lying between dried riverbeds, an old man walked with his grandchildren. He wore tattered garments made from animal skins. His long white hair fluttered in the wind, his hunched back bending further as he trudged forward with heavy steps. The children carried simple sticks in their hands, trying to understand the words of this ancient man who seemed like a relic from another world. He was one of the few who had survived. Once he was a professor teaching thousands of students. Now he was merely a storyteller. The eldest child, Edvin, asked curiously, "Grandfather, was it true that people weren't as few as we are now?" The old man squinted his eyes, gazing into the distance. His eyes bore traces of both sorrow and deep wisdom. "No, Edvin. We were once millions. We had gigantic cities, trains, cars, airplanes. The world was a radiant, shining home. Until the Red Plague came." Old James Howard Smith was once a professor in San Francisco. When he thought of those days, he still couldn't believe how life could change so drastically. The streets of the city were lively. People went to work. Children played in the parks. Science had advanced, and technology made life easier. But no one could have imagined that an invisible enemy would bring this grand civilization to its knees. At first, no one took the illness seriously. Newspapers mentioned a few strange deaths in New York, red spots, sudden tremors, and deadly fever. The medical community thought it was just another type of flu. But as days went by, the death toll surged. Its contagion was so high that once infected, a person would die within a few hours, spreading the disease to those around them. Then, unexpectedly, the great cities began to collapse. People fled their homes, flooding the streets in panic. Armies entered cities to contain the disease, but it was futile, for the Red Plague followed no rules. James Howard Smith was still teaching at the university when the disease started to spread. But soon, the campus closed, and students and professors rushed back to their homes in panic. Smith also decided to take his family and flee the city. But the roads were filled with corpses. People were trampling each other in fear, fighting over food. The Red Plague covered the body with red spots, followed by violent tremors that killed its victims within hours. Doctors were helpless. Governments collapsed. Order vanished. Smith, along with a small group, fled to the mountains, witnessing the cities fall one by one. In San Francisco, skyscrapers burned and people struggled with hunger and disease. Radio stations went silent. Government officials either died or fled. In just a few weeks, the world reverted from the modern age to the Stone Age. Within a month, humanity was almost wiped out. Billions perished within weeks. The few survivors escaped to forests and mountains, fighting disease, starvation, and savage humans. Smith and a few others took refuge in a farmhouse. But, as time went on, some of them also caught the disease and died. In the end, the old professor was left alone. Over the years, the few survivors rebuilt a new life amid the remnants of civilization. Nothing was the same anymore. Once there were banks, governments, science, and art. Now, survival was the only purpose. Smith turned to his grandchildren, taking a deep breath. "We must rebuild the world we have forgotten," he said. "But the real question is, can we truly rebuild civilization, or will we repeat the same mistakes and face extinction once again?" The children listened to the heavy words they couldn't fully understand, gazing at their grandfather. They were fascinated by stories of the old world, yet perhaps they didn't need to mourn a world they had never known. For they were the children of the new world. Old James Howard Smith continued his tale under the curious eyes of his grandchildren. Their gazes were filled with fear and admiration. For Grandpa Smith wasn't just narrating their known world, but also a civilization they could never imagine. Once, great cities stood on this land. Lights illuminated the night as if it were day. People soared in the sky with airplanes and filled roads with cars. Food was abundant. No one knew hunger. But now, Smith pointed to the distance with his hand. Where San Francisco's skyscrapers once stood, now only ruins remained. Nature had reclaimed the concrete. Trees swallowed the streets and vines burst through walls. All that remains is wreckage, and we are the last who remember that civilization, Smith said. Though the grandchildren couldn't grasp his words, they felt the sorrow in his voice. Smith continued his story. The disease spread so quickly that no one understood what was happening. The sick died within hours, infecting those around them. Governments fell. Armies disbanded. People started killing each other in the streets. Edvin asked with wide eyes, "Why did people kill each other, Grandpa?" Smith looked at his grandson with a bitter smile. "Fear and hunger. People looted food to avoid starvation. When order collapsed, everyone tried to save themselves. Once there was justice, there were police. But when the Red Plague came, the laws died too." Smith described the horror he witnessed. Cities burned, corpses rotted in the streets. The few survivors became savage. Bands roamed, looting, and the strong oppressed the weak. Smith and his family fled the city to rural areas, but fear reigned even there. No one trusted anyone. The infected were killed, for once someone fell ill. Those around them would die too. The children tried to imagine the world their grandfather described, but they couldn't envision airplanes, skyscrapers, or cities that never slept. They belonged to a generation that walked barefoot on stones, hunted animals, and lived in harmony with nature. Edvin asked, "Grandpa, why did they all die, but you survived?" Smith sighed deeply. "I don't know. Maybe I was lucky, or maybe I was cursed, but I survived. And now I tell you this story because you will rebuild this world." Though the children didn't understand his words, they saw the determination in his eyes. They were learning from this old man who carried the ghosts of the past. As the sun set, Smith embraced his grandchildren. "Go play now. But remember, you must be strong, for the world is now a cruel place." The children ran off, and Smith watched them go, lost in memories of the past. Cities, music, laughter. And then, the Red Plague. The children tried to imagine the world their grandfather described, but they couldn't envision airplanes, skyscrapers, or cities that never slept. They belonged to a generation that walked barefoot on stones, hunted animals, and lived in harmony with nature. Edvin asked, "Grandpa, why did they all die, but you survived?" Smith sighed deeply. "I don't know. Maybe I was lucky, or maybe I was cursed, but I survived. And now I tell you this story because you will rebuild this world." Though the children didn't understand his words, they saw the determination in his eyes. They were learning from this old man who carried the ghosts of the past. As the sun set, Smith embraced his grandchildren. "Go play now. But remember, you must be strong, for the world is now a cruel place." The children ran off, and Smith watched them go, lost in memories of the past. Cities, music, laughter. And then, the Red Plague.